All right, welcome back, economists. We are here to think about probably some of the most significant topics that are on our curriculum for Unit 2, and that is microeconomics. We're going to kind of wrap up a lot of things that we have been talking about here and synthesize them into one video. The purpose of this video here is to think about government solutions, or policies rather, that can be used to try to limit the impacts of negative externalities and or common access resources. These are huge problems. One of the ones that we have talked about so far in class is the market for fish. We mentioned that global fish stocks are a common access or common pool resource because primarily they are not owned by anybody. They swim in international waters. No specific country has the territorial claim to the waters that are occupied by those fish. And as long as a business has the factors of production to go and access those fish, a boat and a crew that can make it out to sea, fish, and come back, they are more or less free to take those resources. There's kind of no restrictions on what they can do. So as a result, they are overfished. This is an example of a tragedy of the commons. Pretty significant problem here, mostly for the future of our ecosystems and future consumers of seafood. The ocean is a very important source for protein for people, and it's a very important part of some diets around the world. But also there are other industries that rely on the ocean for a standard of living, such as tourism and things like that. Okay? So you can use these diagrams, and we're going to show how to manipulate them for either a demerit good, as in, obviously behind us you can see here that there's a negative consumption externality, or a common access resource, right? So you can diagram a common access resource as either a negative consumption externality or a negative production one. Just for the purposes of this video, we're going to talk about it from the standpoint of a negative consumption externality, assuming that global fish stocks are overconsumed in an unsustainable way. So if we're thinking about what can the government do to either limit demerit goods, so instead of fish you could put alcohol, you could put cigarettes, those kinds of products, fossil fuels. You could swap out the labels here and the graphs will still work just fine, okay? But I have put this up as a common pool or a common access resource. Just make the distinction though, global fish stocks are obviously not a demerit good. They are a common pool or a common access resource. That's an important distinction to make, okay? So there's really two things we can do in sort of market forces to try to limit the consumption of something that's causing a negative externality, regardless of what the cause is. So first of all, we can try to impact demand. We can try to get people to consume less of that thing by decreasing demand. Obviously, the other market force that we're considering here, that we're going to draw on this diagram, is how to show a decrease in supply. A decrease in supply, of course, as we know, drives up prices, and through the law of demand, as the price increases, the quantity demanded decreases. That's essentially what we're going to show here, just on an externality graph instead. Okay? But first, let's think about how do we reduce demand for fish, or how do we reduce demand for some demerit goods? We really have two options. Number one, the government can try to run some kind of education program. If you're thinking about different types of illegal drugs, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but if you watch the public service announcement about this is your brain on drugs, and they crack an egg into a frying pan and a bunch of bad stuff happens to that egg, right? That's the kind of thing we're looking for. The government can run advertisements saying, look, if we're not careful about how we consume this resource, we're going to be out of it soon, and if global fish stocks collapse, we're going to be in real trouble, and that especially includes people who don't even consume fish, okay? So they can try to raise awareness through some kind of education campaign. Another option that government could consider It's a little bit more indirect. It doesn't tackle the problem exactly, but they could do subsidies for substitutes. So a reasonable substitute for fish is chicken. Now chicken's already pretty cheap. That's a pun there. I swear I didn't intend to make that one. Chicken's already pretty low in price, right? So this one might not be too effective, but for something that is expensive, like cigarettes are getting quite expensive as a result of taxes here, the government could subsidize a substitute or something that might reduce demand, okay? So if we can probably show that pretty easily on a supply and demand graph, but showing that on an externality graph is a little bit more tricky. Remember that MSB stands for marginal social benefit, right? Marginal social benefit is the optimal demand, right? At this level of demand, there is no externality. But the problem is, this is the real demand. This is the actual demand, right? So in this case, global fish stocks are overconsumed. Again, the reason for that is there's no private property rights, no ways to restrict the access for these companies who are harvesting these fish. So how would we show a decrease in demand? Well, we would take this curve, which is the real demand curve, and shift it this way. Now, whatever combination of policies government might use to try to decrease demand, it's probably not going to fix the issue entirely, especially if we're thinking about the market for fish and the nature of the problem here, which is a common access or common pool resource. All right? So what I would recommend you do on your graphs, whether it's a paper 1 or an IA commentary or something like that, is just kind of split the difference between the initial MPB curve and the MSB curve, and just draw a curve right in the middle here. And what we're essentially showing here is pretty simple. All we are really showing is that demand is decreasing. And once we do that, the price will come down. And most importantly, the quantity demanded will decrease. Okay? Now we've shown progress towards fixing the problem. We haven't shown that whatever policies the government could come up with that might decrease demand will fix the problem entirely. That's probably really unlikely given the nature of the problem here, but these policies might make some progress here. Okay? So that's how to show a decrease of demand on a negative consumption externality. Again, this is the initial demand curve basically. This is the second demand curve. You're just showing that's decreasing, right? Same as a supply and demand diagram, just on an externality graph instead. All right, so this one here, we're going to show how to decrease supply, all right? So all of these 4 policies here, indirect taxes, tradable permits, legislation and regulation, and international agreements, those are all listed on the guide. What those policies will do is they will decrease supply. We already know about indirect taxes. If a national government, like the government of Germany, were to pass a law saying we're going to put an indirect tax on fish at 10% and all seafood products to disincentivize consumers to buy fish, we know that that decreases supply. Even though it's a tax, it decreases supply because it's an indirect tax. We have done a video on that one. If you need an explanation for why that decreases supply and not demand, I'd recommend you go back and watch that one. Tradable permits, we haven't exactly talked about that one yet. A tradable permit is when a business, you usually sort of more see this in the fossil fuel sector, businesses will basically purchase permission from the government to pollute. All right? So tradable permits probably wouldn't work too well with global fish stocks because that's not existing in one specific country. That's a common pool or a common access resource, right? But let's say within a country, within the boundaries of a country, if you did tradable permits for fish, then fishing businesses would have to pay the government. They would buy a permit and they could catch fish up to the limit of the permit, but not any more than that. If they wanted to catch more than the limit, probably registered in tons or something like that, then they'd have to buy an extra permit. Now, let's say a business doesn't fish up to the permit. Let's say the limit of the permit is 10,000 tons, and they only harvest 5,000 tons of fish. Well, they can sell, part of their permit to another business that maybe needs it. So it's a tradable permit. It's like it basically functions like a commodity almost, right? So tradable permits, legislation and regulation. So maybe, a government says, look, you can only catch 6,000 pounds of a certain species of fish in one season. That is basically a law that is restricting the amount of fish that a business can produce, and that will decrease supply as well. And probably this is what we really need if we're thinking about common pool or common access resources. We need an international agreement. You see this a lot with climate change and the market for fossil fuels. That's been in the news quite a lot recently, with sort of the Paris Climate Agreement and even previous versions of global agreements like that. Basically, a bunch of countries need to get on the same page about the problem. So if we're thinking about overfishing in the North Pacific, then countries like Japan, Russia, China, the United States, and Canada would all have to come to some sort of agreement about how to limit the amount of fish that are taken out of the sea each year, and maybe even what species and things like that. Those are very difficult to coordinate. International agreements of any kind, really, whether it's trade policies or things like legislation and regulation. Those are very difficult to get countries to agree on the same thing. They're also very difficult to enforce. But if they can work, it has the same effect as all of the other policies mentioned here, and that they decrease supply. Now, you might be looking at this and think, how would we show a decrease in supply on this? It's a negative consumption externality. So that's pretty simple. Remember that this marginal social cost is effectively our supply curve, right? So it's not going to be any different than a supply and demand diagram that shows a decrease in supply. We're just going to simply move that marginal social cost curve to the left. Now, we're going to do that. Again, we don't want to really show that it's totally going to fix the problem. So we're not going to totally fix the issue of overconsumption of fish. We don't want to show that quantity 1 decreases all the way to the optimal quantity. That's probably not going to happen, at least in our lifetimes, but we can make progress towards it, right? So all of these different policies will kind of have the same effect on this graph, okay? So this is marginal social cost 2, that's 1. All of these policies decrease supply. We'll make some progress. We'll have a decrease in the amount of fish taken out of the ocean every year. That's definitely needed, and probably most importantly, we will push up the price of fish, and through the law of demand, people will consume less of it. Okay? So this is how to fix a negative consumption externality. You could swap out fish or air quality. Those are common pool or common access resources. You could swap that out for any kind of demerit good that causes a negative consumption externality, and the graphs would look the same. Okay? So just a bit of an explanation about how to manipulate these externality graphs. So in the next video, we will do how to try to look at solutions to fix a negative externality of production instead of consumption. Okay? Thanks, guys.